Welcome back to another edition of MLL230. This is World Language and Communities. Today we're talking about endangered languages and language revitalization. So I've already kind of brushed on this topic on the first lecture when I talked about the diversity of languages, talking about how languages become so diverse. What contributes to our language diversity? Why do we have so many speakers of particular languages, but so few speakers of other languages, right? And we're going to focus a little bit more on how to revitalize these endangered languages. Is there a way to bring them back to life after they are dying or they're dead, right? So there's a quote that I really like. It is accurate to say that languages do not die, they only get transformed, okay? And that is because it's when they say the language dies, you're not really talking about you're talking about the speakers dying, right? And it's less likely. I mean, there have been instances in the past that a speaker will die and that language will die with them. But for the most part, when we talk about language death, we're talking about language transformation, aka the languages transform into something else. So, for example, when you have Latin, we say it's a dead language. They transform into the forms, other forms. So, for example, we have Italian, we have Spanish, we have French, we have other languages of Latin roots. So even if Latin is quote unquote dead, it just becomes another language. It transforms. So, when we talk about a dead language is a language that is no longer spoken as a mother tongue, okay? As your native language, although some anthropologists don't like that term, as your first language, okay? So this would be your classical languages. These would be Sumerian, Akkadian, Egyptian, Hittite. These are languages that you can tell that people spoke these in the past because there are recordings, there are scripts, there are written languages featuring these languages. So you can already tell that these languages, because they're not spoken anymore, then they would say that they are dead. Here's a funny joke. Latin is a language as dead as can be. First it killed the Romans, and now it's killing me. So maybe some of you took a Latin, right, in high school. And, so my question would be, why did you take Latin, right? It's not like you can talk about it to someone else. It's not like you can speak Latin fluently, right, to somebody. But a lot of the liturgical texts, right, if a lot of medical terms are still in Latin. The way that they name scientific things are in Latin. So Latin still carries an important weight, even if it's not spoken as a first language. So dead languages that descend, they get transformed, right? Is Latin said to be dead because no Romance language today bears its name? We also have a second form of a dead language without descendants. A given language becomes increasingly restricted in use and ultimately ceases to be passed on. So when we're talking about language death, we're really focusing on those languages that do not get passed on, those languages that are shifted, okay? So in some cases, the languages die, but when we say the languages die, we really say the languages are shifted, okay? That means that the speakers do not speak that language anymore. It's not that the speakers die, it's that the languages that the speakers use have transformed or they shift. So speakers voluntarily or unwillingly shift to another generally dominant, more prestigious, more powerful language and choose not to teach their native language or languages to their children. So the last part is really important here when you talk about teaching your language to your children, because the children are really the ones that are going to carry on the legacy of this language. when we talk about pidgins and creoles and the differences between pidgins and creoles, pidgins are kind of this flux of languages. It's a language contact situation where, I might be using some words of another language. You might be using some words of another languages. We kind of have this mishmash of languages. But it doesn't become a quote unquote full-fledged language, some people say, until their children speak it, okay? Even though I'd argue that pidgins are full-fledged languages in and of themselves. But a Creole is a pidgin that is spoken by the children. So when one language meets another, usually it goes one or two ways. There could be language maintenance, okay? So let's take the example in your textbook, they talk about Spanish, right? So Spanish in the United States. Okay, so there are people who speak Spanish as their native or mother tongue. They moved to the United States. So there's ways in which they can maintain Spanish, right? They can speak Spanish at home. They can invite elders who speak the language. They can immerse themselves. They can have various opportunities to speak Spanish. But another way that languages can transform is language shift. So that means that instead of, speaking, the kids, instead of speaking Spanish that their parents spoke, now they speak English, right? And maybe they speak a little bit of Spanish at home, but they mostly speak English at school, at work, around their friends, etc., etc. So that's when we say this is how language shifts. Language shift has been known to, in the United States at least, to occur within 3 generations. So you have the first generation in which the speakers, they retain their L1 or their first language, and they do not learn the L2, which is their second language. So, this would be like my grandma came from China and she lived in Chinatown and she in New York City, and she did not learn any English, right? She just spoke Chinese, everyone she knew, and if you spoke English to her, she'd speak back in Chinese. And then gradually over time, her kids moved from China in their 20s, right? So my parents moved to China, or from China to the United States in their 20s, and they learned the English as an additional language. So they're able to kind of be this bilingual, this carrier between the native or local language to the current language, so of their host country. So for example, they're able to kind of be bilingual in both Chinese and in English. So they're, what's referred to as the 1.5 generation. They can kind of be in this flux, right? And then their generation, so that's me, they can learn L2 as the additional language, right? But it replaces their L1. So this would be, if I learned Chinese, as I spoke Chinese to my parents, my grandparents as a child, but then I grew up in America, so I only spoke English. And then over time, that replaced my Chinese, right? So in some cases, this happens within the lifetime of one person. So maybe it's gradually, right? It's less likely that there's a switch that gets turned off, right? And it's more like, okay, I'm speaking Chinese less and less as I go off to college, as I, meet new people, as I move out of my community, people start to speak another language. And this is where we say the language shifts, right? So again, to qualify, how language dies, right? This is very different than Latin. This is where the speakers themselves, consciously or unconsciously, they start to pick up another language, and that language replaces their first language. So, this can happen at a community level, right? So the process by which one language displaces another in a linguistic repertoire of a community. So maybe you grew up in a you grew up in a German town, okay? You spoke German to everyone, and everyone spoke German back, and there's lots of German bakeries. And then over time, German is starting to be less used, because you live in Hungary. You have a very small German community in Hungary, and Hungarian is more and more used, right? So this can happen from the ground level, or it can happen from the top. So if it's top to bottom, that means that the government is saying, hey, listen, we're living in Hungary now, right? We want everyone to be Hungarian. We want everyone to be, a citizen. So maybe you can speak German at your hometown or in your homes. But when we're talking about schools, when we're talking about government, we're only going to speak the official languages. So that is when the language shifts because it ceases to be used in high functions. In previous classes, we talked about high and low, like high and low German. It's very similar here, where we're talking about, the language themselves are used in different domains. So over time, you have this kind of hierarchy of which languages are going to be used in government, and then, an official paper has official status. And then this is coming from the top to bottom. So like from a government level down to the people. So then you have also from bottom to top. So, this is where maybe you have people from a school, right? People from the community that say, okay, we're only going to be use this language for specific functions. So this could be, for example, Hebrew can be used in specific clerical contexts, but it's not necessarily you don't use Hebrew anywhere else. Like if you're Jewish and you have a bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah, maybe you'll use Hebrew, right, in those very specific contexts, but you're going to speak English, right, in other contexts. So there's different domains that people within a community level use a language, or how they decide to use one language for one specific part and not for another. So the scale of language loss, we've talked about this before, but 90% of human knowledge is encoded in language, right? And we're talking about, there's a lot of varieties, lots of factors going on when we talk about how people lose their language. Are they losing their land? Are they indigenous, right? Because when settlers, when colonials came to a country and they would settle upon a place, they would make the indigenous people learn their language. And that was a way of stripping them of their culture. So you're not only stripping these people of their land, you're also stripping them of their language and their culture. And then also, because those languages encode so much of human knowledge, right? It's like how we talk to each other, we are sharing knowledge back and forth. So if you don't have a means to share knowledge, that knowledge becomes lost. So those languages die. We know that, if we think about language loss as knowledge, as an erosion of knowledge, then, every 2 weeks a language dies. And that is erasing a lot of our indigenous identities and societies, and the vast amount of information, the vast amount of knowledge that they have. There was a 2003 UNESCO paper that compared language death to losing biological or ecological knowledge. It's like you go to the rainforest and there is a specific type of plant, right? And this plant can cure a specific type of cancer, right? And then someone goes to the rainforest and kills all these plants, right? So now you don't know how this plant can, we don't have the means to cure this cancer because of this plant, I know that that's a stretch, really, but kind of the same thing here. I mean, like, for generations, there have been lots of people who speak different languages, and those languages don't necessarily they're not written down, right? If we're talking about language as a real ingenuity of human civilization, and those languages become lost or they die, then the knowledge itself also dies with it. Right. Reduces knowledge of human language and mind, and also death of unique cultures, right? There's so many, we know so much about Roman culture, right? What do we know about ancient Mayans? What do we know about the ancient Sumerians? It's a lot we don't know because the language isn't passed on, right? And written language is something that's very, very recent, right? Like drawing on cave walls or the Rosetta Stone. That's something that's very recent, right? There's so many languages that don't have that, especially with this growing rate of technology, which we'll talk about later. So, we talked about the scale of languages that we have today. Like, even if I'm posting this PowerPoint slide, I'm sure that the number of languages have gone down. It's not going up. It's not going up. And, we talked about how 95% of the languages in the world are spoken by 6%. Okay? So most of the languages that we know, that have a dwindling number of speakers, they're almost extinct. And if you were to kind of like pan out, the median size of language in the world is about 3,000 speakers. Although, I mean, it's more drastic than that, right? Where we're taking the median, which means like the middle number. But when you look at the scale, it's like a lot of people speak these languages, and a very little, a small number of people speak most of the languages in the world. So, here's a chart that talks about, that lists all the endangered and extinct languages. And again, you can see that this chart follows the language shift diagram that I explained before, kind of like how it's the language is safe when it's spoken by all generations. My great-great-grandparents spoke it. My great-grandparents spoke it. My grandparents speak it. My parents speak it. I speak it. My children will speak it, right? It's safe. But it depends as the generations go along, it becomes less and less safe, right? Until it becomes extinct and there are no speakers left. So, if some of the atlas has the extinct languages, since the atlas was, I think it was created in the 1950s. So if they had this language that was like written down somewhere, we can assume that no one speaks it now if there's no speakers left. So here are the consequences. The consequences are discussed in terms of human rights, ethics, social justice, and maintaining culture, identity, and heritage. Of course, we talked about the interrelations between language and the environment, right? Like the traditional ecological knowledge, the biocultural diversity. There's a story of these pilots that landed in the middle of Micronesia. And, once they landed, they were trying to find food, right? They couldn't find any food. And then they starved to death. And then when the people found their bodies later, they saw that they were surrounded by all these different plants that they could eat. But they didn't know, they didn't have the knowledge, right? They didn't know any of the local customs. They didn't know any of the local languages. And so that's very, I don't know if the story is true, but that is kind of like an allegory to what language loss is. You're surrounded by all these different languages that have these rich knowledge of humankind. It tells us something about human society, about human culture, about who we are as humans on this earth. And yet we're allowing these languages to die. We're allowing these, same thing for, the environment, what we're doing to the environment. We're allowing these rich biomes to die. So I kind of showed you a similar chart about the geographical distribution of the languages, and you can see that they're all kind of clustered here. Maybe around the equator, maybe around places where it's very tropical. And to give you an example of, what people can do, how do you kind of capture a language that's dying? How do you know that a language is dying? Do you ask people like, oh, what languages do you speak? Do you think it's dying? It's less so of that. It's more so they go to communities and they ask, okay, what languages do you speak to your children? What languages do you speak to your parents? Etc., etc. So I'll just give an example of some indigenous languages of Quebec and Labrador in Canada. So there is an Algonquian language called Innu, and Innu was spoken by the indigenous people in Labrador, in northern Canada, and then before the French settlers came. So when the French translators came, there were some lost in translation moments, okay? In that the way that they talked about traditional way of life, they didn't have the terminology for it. So, the terminology in traditional knowledge is very specific. Just to give you more of a location of where, the indigenous people, First Nations people live today. So the linguists, they went in and they, asked them about their medicinal knowledge, like, oh, what kind of plants do you use? Or what kind of salves do you use? If I had a headache, if I had stomachache, if someone was pregnant, like, what would you give them? And so the translation that they gave was, they said this in their language, and they said, it is only after we soaked his hand in liquid poison, and it is healed. So the translator got this was they were saying, okay, Matashi, Natuku, Naput, maybe, that I've heard Natashi, Machi before, and that means like strong or bad. And then I've also heard like, this Nataku, Napuli. So maybe that's an infusion of a medicinal plant or herbal tea, right? And they translated it as liquid poison. But what they really mean was that it was a disinfectant, right? So, you can kind of see these translations come about. If you've taken my MLL230 class, we have an exercise in which we look at Hmong speakers, right? So the Hmong speakers from Laos come to the United States. They don't have a word for hospital, right? So they kind of translate it as a place where people are healed or a place where people die, right? And so, it's even words that are lost in translation that occurs because, not everything can be translated to English, right? It's and people say like, okay, well, why can't we just get this medicinal knowledge? Why can't we just get this knowledge and then translate it into English? It's a little bit more complicated. So there's also ecological knowledge, right? So, the Innu translator was translating, for example, there's a rock that looks like Ulakan Mashkushu, and then they said, question mark. They weren't sure what this meant, but the intended meaning was that it looks like a fern, right? Or there's certain medicinal species, there's certain biological species, ecological species that we do not have the word for in English. Just to show you an indication of, this is indigenous languages. These people have been living in these places for centuries, and they have such a wealth of knowledge, and their knowledge is not easily translated. And then also, just to give you a last example, the translation was, there we had some food, the place that we left behind, there's some flour, there was some scaffolding there. And the targeted meaning was that there was a cache there, not necessarily scaffolding. Right, so just to show you again that there is, certain complexities, certain intricacies, like the pilot story, these people know the way of the land, and it's very difficult to capture this in our perception, in our language, right? And that's why it's important to document, indigenous languages, because they have a wealth of knowledge that is encapsulated within their language. If you believe that language and culture are closely intertwined, this is part of their culture that we're talking about, that we don't really necessarily have the context of, or, this translator is trying to give you a Western context of scaffolding, but it's not really a scaffold. So, just how do we transmit this traditional knowledge, right? So there's this indigenous population, they're kind of acculturating to a modern way of life within Canada, a welfare state. So, we have some language shifts in some communities, and then we have first language attrition in others, which means that some of these indigenous members, they're not even waiting until the second or third generation. They are already being lost within the first generation, right? So within a single generation, the language associated with travel journeys, navigational routes, hunting, fishing practices are lost within one generation, okay? So it's like you grew up in this community, and it's not necessarily that that your child will lose this language. You also will lose this language. So it's becoming faster than 3 generations that we've seen before. And these, I'm sure you can draw parallels to Cherokee, Sioux, Lumbee tribes of in North Carolina and in the South, that these indigenous tribes, they've undergone a lot of changes. They've integrated in the global economy. People are leaving the reservations for other opportunities. The Blackfoot Indians in, Montana talk about this. They talk about how people aren't, they're leaving for more opportunities, for more employment, for education. These are the priorities for the younger generations, right? But the elders and the language activists, they stress the importance of maintaining ties. So we're not saying it's bad to leave your community. We're not saying that you shouldn't go out and get a job or, go get formal education. What we are saying is you need to maintain these ties to your culture, okay? Because this is, your culture, your language, because this is really part of your identity. And this, the kind of foundation for preserving these languages in the future. Right, so let's transition from, talking about endangered languages to talking about how do we preserve languages? How do we document these languages? So in your reading, it says to promote the identification of this word, preserving, as referred to language with maintain in context, and maintain through continued use and development in a way similar to how the word is increasingly understood in relation to biodiversity. Okay, So what linguists are trying to do is that they're really pushing preserving language akin to preserving biodiversity, because everyone understands, like everyone is like, hey, we have this species of panda, we have this, or we have a species of tiger. I'm just going to use the panda. We have this panda, right? And if I said save the pandas, we want more pandas, we want pandas to survive for for the next 100 years, you would hopefully be down with that. You would say, yeah, I want my children to see a panda. But how is it that you don't want your children to speak Innu, right? Or Spanish or any of your local languages, right? We're trying to language activists are trying to kind of create the sense of, we want to protect species. We want a future where there's great diversity in animals. We also want great diversity in language. And I think I've showed this chart in previous slides, but how vital is the language today? It depends on the number of factors. How many speakers? What are the official language attitudes? What are the shifts in domain use? What are the members' attitudes towards their language? What is the availability of materials and language education? So, what can we do to preserve a language or revitalize a language? Well, there's many different policies that you could do, right? A language policy. We'll talk about language policy we talked about that with Belgium, right? How Belgium has this kind of bilingual language policy. So we could say, hey, to our government, we could say, like, we want Spanish to be an official language, or we want Spanish to be a protected language in this country, right? So governments can actually do this. They can make languages official or not. There's also development of language maintenance and revitalization programs, like, a lot of bilingual schools, immersion schools. For example, schools in Hawaii, right? They're learning Hawaiian. The children are learning Hawaiian. After many, many, many years of people not speaking Hawaiian, now they're teaching it in the school so the children can learn it, even if the parents couldn't. So, you can involve more language programs, language and education programs, which I'm very in favor for, right? And public awareness. Like, again, like there's so many cute advertisements for pandas, right? Like they're just so cute and we want to preserve them and we want to save their lives. But we don't really have this public awareness of language that as we do pandas. But this is from the language policy standpoint, the UN came up with a universal declaration. Maybe this is UNESCO. Well, someone came up with a universal declaration of linguistic rights, right? Because language is really a right. You have a right to your language. You have a right to be recognized as a member of your language. You have a right to your own language, right? Not only private, but also public, right? A lot of people say, like, yeah, it's okay for you to speak Spanish at home, but here you're going to speak American, right? You're going to speak English. But no, you have a right to speak your own language in private and in public. You have a right to your own name, right? You have a right to interrelate or associate with other members of your language community of origin. You have a right to maintain and develop one's culture. And so this might seem a little self-explanatory. Like, this might seem like, why do we have language rights? Like, why do we need to have this? And it is because in the past, we've had what's called language genocide. We'll examine a case hopefully soon. But out of that, we have this declaration that we need this language. You have a right to your own language. David Crystal, famous linguist, he said, okay, in order for a successful language revitalization, that is, if you want this language to survive, then you have to have these 6 factors. You have to increase the prestige within the dominant community. right? So if you're in Canada and you're a French speaker, you're francophone, then you'd say, okay, we want French to have prestige, right? We want, if you speak French, people are going to love you. You can go to, like you can travel around. You have that je ne sais quoi, right? You have prestige. A language also must have increased their wealth, okay? If, like a lot of these programs, they take money, right? I know Cherokee, a lot of the money that comes from the reservations, from the casinos, go into their language revitalization. It takes money to do a language, right? But also, do the languages themselves, like, do they have wealth? Do they have spending money? Do they have ways in which they can produce materials, right? Is it we don't want a bare bones operation. Can they increase their legitimate power in the eyes of the dominant community, right? So whatever, in the United States, people have to be like, okay, I want to learn Turkish, right? That's a legitimate language. I want to learn Arabic. I want to learn Arabic because not only so I can speak to my friends, but I know that if I were able to speak Arabic, I can do business one day. Or I could, if I speak Chinese, I could move to China and have, China's an economic power, right? Like, you have to kind of increase people's perceptions of the language and give the language power. It needs to have a strong presence in the education system, okay? So it's not like you go to school and you only learn English and Spanish, right? You need to have because you might not learn a lot, right? You need to have like a committed education program. So like a lot of people, they put their kids in weekend Korean schools or Chinese schools. And that is a way for them to, have a strong presence for the children. Can write down the language. So this is controversial because I told you before that there's a lot of different oral languages that aren't passed down, right? And there's been a lot of ways. I think in the 1950s, they tried to use like the Romanized script, right? To try to write down some of the languages. But even that is controversial, right? If they don't have their own writing system, it can very much be lost. And the last one is can make use of electronic technology, okay? Can this Wikipedia article, or can I go on the internet and find this language and read sources in this language? Because, everyone's on the internet these days, okay? Can you find your language on the TikTok? So there's, like I mentioned, there's lots of language revitalization programs. I just Googled, language revitalization program. And I came up with this Hawaiian school. Okay, it's a school in Hawaii. And you can see right off the bat how they stand on the Hawaiian language, right? Because it says, I olaka olelo Hawaii, the Hawaiian language shall live. And I was like, okay. It's kind of like in Game of Thrones where they have like their sigil, like winter is coming, or what is dead may not die, or something like that. Like this one is like their sigil, like they're like, okay, our motto is the Hawaiian language shall live, and that's pretty strong. That I have no qualms about where you stand on the Hawaiian language. And if you're confused, you can also go to their website, and they have a philosophy statement. Their philosophy statement says, at the core of the philosophy's foundation lies the Maoli Hawaii, the unique life force which is cultivated by, emanates from, and distinguishes a person who self-identifies as a Hawaiian. If tended properly, this Maoli, like a well-tended fire, can burn brightly. If not, like a neglected fire, it can die out. 4 major elements of the individual's life-giving Maoli are identified. Ka'ao pili uani, the spiritual element. Ka'ao olelo, the language element. Ke'ao lawena, the physical behavior element. Ke'ao, like ku'una, the traditional language element. So Yeah, they're very strong. They're very strong, right? If you're Hawaiian, please put on the discussion board about how terrible my pronunciation is, but also about, this this comparison again to like a fire, right? Like if you can keep the fire going, it's great. You'll have, you're thriving, you're cooking, you're able to congregate. If you don't keep up the language, you will die out. Let's switch over to New Zealand. New Zealand, they have a great language revitalization program. Te Kohuana Reo means the language nest. Okay, so they have this, like, again, what David Crystal calls the 6 elements of language revitalization. They have these schools that are available to where you can go be immersed in the Maori language, the indigenous language of New Zealand. Everyone learns Maori in the schools, right? And it's been so successful that some of these children that grow up in these schools are now the second generation, or now parents, right? So their kids, maybe their parents didn't speak it, but they speak it, and then their kids will speak it because these language revitalization programs are so popular, right? So this is really bringing a language back to life. The use of media, okay? We talked about media. We talked about, how are they using the languages, right? Like how are, it's not only that you speak a language at home, read a language materials, you also consume a lot of media. You need to be able to have, promote the Maori language. And so this is like kind of like their radio station. 21 Maori radio stations across New Zealand, which is very cool. Switch over to Finland, okay? The Karelian language. And they have these, I think it's their version of Pippi Longstocking, or maybe like we stole Pippi Longstocking from them, Pippi Longstocking from Finland. But they're able to kind of transform children's books into the indigenous language. And to jumpstart our case study here, we're gonna look at Guatemala. Okay, we're gonna look at the indigenous languages of Guatemalan, Mayan languages of Guatemala. Okay, Mayan language revitalization. So I've had the opportunity, actually. I studied abroad in Guatemala in grad school. I did an ethnographic research school, and it's one of the reasons why Guatemala attracted to me was because there are 22 recognized official languages in Guatemala. Okay, 22 languages. For kind of a small country, it's like, I was like, oh, okay, that's very cool. As you know, the United States doesn't have an official language. But Guatemala, this country, has 22. And so, of course, we want to look at, what are the historic people who have lived there, the indigenous people. And you can see, like, most of Guatemala, were Mayans from the Mayan Peninsula. They were populated with Mayans. So this was like a big Mayan civilization. They did the Mayan calendar and everything like that, right? And they're people who are descended from those Mayans. And then over time, you had, some of the Spanish colonialists came, and then they became, what's called the Ladino. So they're kind of like the Spanish speaking population. But there's still a lot of, so Spanish is widely spoken. Of course, it's an official language of Guatemala as well. But there's also other languages. There's Quiche, there's Mam. I lived right here near this lake. And so I spoke a little bit of Cachiquel. But there's Tutsutil. There's lots of indigenous Mayan languages. Some people might be bilingual. Some of the Mayan speakers might be bilingual. So there's indigenous Mayans that still speak their language. And, we have different dialects, you can trace back the different languages that they spoke, throughout time, and see that, they're all descended from this Proto-Mayan language. So, As you can see in your reading, there was a big Mayan movement. Okay, there's the distinctions between the Mayans who are indigenous and the non-Mayans who are the Ladino population. So, they really wanted to. The Mayans really wanted to create pride, right? Because again, like David Crystal says, you need the population to be proud of their language because it's part of their identity. By raising the Mayas' consciousness of their roots and promoting the value of languages as a link with the glorious past and a symbol of authenticity. Okay, that's really a good quote, because like, we know when we think about the Mayans, we think about, like the little drawings, the pyramids. We think about the Mayan calendar, right? We think about the gods that they used to believe in. We think about like how they invented chocolate and how they used to drink this weird drink, right? And I gave them visions. But this is kind of their history, right? There's this glorious past. So this Maya movement was really like, we should speak Mayan because, like, we're descended from these kings. Like, we are descended from these warriors, right? And so it really was a sense of pride for them, right? But I think just like a lot of places in Latin America, there's lots of tensions with colonialism. Even still, you can see the roots of it today with the Spanish conquest, right? Even though it maintained independence, there was the Civil War for many, many, many years. The United States actually helped this military lead a coup against the government, right? And really it led to genocide for many years. And during this time, I mean, like 250,000 people died. Like, you can still go. When I went to Guatemala, like, we interviewed with a lot of the native Mayan indigenous people, and they could talk about their time in the Civil War. It was a really dark time, and again, sponsored by the United States. 450 Mayan villages were eliminated. Okay, so these people were killed, their villages destroyed, their homes destroyed, their languages destroyed, right? And then 1 million people were displaced. So it wasn't really until like the 90s that they were able to like get out of the Civil War, but things are still, you can still see the effects of the Civil War today. Right, so today, the population 12 million. Ladino, which is their like mix of indigenous and European roots, like, are the majority of the population. They speak Spanish mostly. The Mayans have 35%, although some studies have them at 60%. Okay, so they're really not sure, right? I mean, if you're coming out of Civil War where a lot of people were decimated, do you really want to say you're Mayan? There's this cultural connotation here. Political stability, question mark, not sure. I used to work for the former ambassador to Guatemala, and I think it's difficult to say even nowadays. But as far as the language use, the changed language attitudes, they hoped that it would reverse the trend of language shift. Okay, they said, like, okay, if we're able to kind of make Mayan an official language, then it will have, more people will speak Mayan, right? Because it's kind of like a I don't want to say apology, but it's kind of like a, all right, I'm sorry about this awful, awful, awful thing. We really respect our culture and our heritage. So, it gave parents guidelines for transmitting their language. They said, okay, maybe speak Mayan to your children, don't speak Spanish. Even after many years, they punished anyone for speaking Mayan. So there's still, now that it's been so many years since the Civil War, but they're still a little bit wary. And rightly so. I mean, there's different attitudes, okay? You can read about this in your reading, but, for example, they said, okay, well, if they know Mayan, then they won't do well in school, right? Because in school, of course, they're learning Spanish. And, that's false, right? Like, you can speak however many languages you want and still be able to acclimate to the language. And even studies show that if you learn literacy in your native language, you're more likely to adapt to the host language. So, for example, if you learn how to read and write in Mayan, you're more likely to learn how to read and write in Spanish, because your literacy serves as a bridge, right? It's kind of like if you can read and write in Spanish, you can learn English. You can read and write in English faster, easier, because you already kind of have that foundation, versus if you're just starting out from scratch. If you don't know anything, and if you don't know how to read and write in Mayan, it's going to be difficult for you to read and write in Spanish. So they wanted to promote literacy. They wanted to spread education. That was their key of advancing Mayan nationalism. There's an increased appreciation of culture, right? Relating writing and power, right? The written language has this power over non-written languages. So they really, like, linguists came in, the government came in, and they said, we want to really document Tutsuhil or Quiche or Mom or Kachikel. And also they wanted to overcome this negative schooling experience, right? So they wanted this Mayan literacy class for predominantly Mayan students taught by Mayans, right? So this hopefully overcame some of the stereotypes about the deficiencies in the Mayan language. Kind of similar to Hawaiian, we talked about, like, they were just like, we want people, we don't want to have role models. We want to have teachers, educators, elders who are speaking this language and who are promoting this language. But like with anything, they have financial problems. They have logistical problems, okay? Just like schools, they don't have enough schools. They don't have enough resources. They don't have enough teachers, right? Because then you have to, like, have a Mayan teacher who not only, like, knows Mayan, but can teach Mayan, right? Because, like, even if you know a language, that doesn't mean that you can teach it. Even if you know English, it doesn't mean that you can teach it. So they have a lot of, problems finding teachers, just like any other bilingual program, really. But, the government said, we're going to really start to promote literacy. We're going to promote Mayan history, Mayan language, Mayan culture. But it's not without its problems, obviously. So, their kind of literacy goals, right? They said, okay, we want there to be respect for the language itself and for the elders of the community whose stock of knowledge is implicitly or explicitly denigrated in the public classroom. They identify with and internalize the values associated with Mayan culture and then serve as models for their children to emulate. Literacy training will succeed if literacy will fulfill some useful function for the individual. Several of the participants became interviewing community elders and succeeded in collecting 50 recipes for the natural medicines in Kachikel. So there's different varieties of literacy, like what they wanted for literacy, right? Like they want them to be literate for the community? Like you can talk to your grandparents about it. Did you want to acculturate with Mayan culture? Did you want to succeed in a job, like finding a job one day? Did you want to come up with these recipes for your intellectual growth, right? There's different caveats. When we say literacy, there's many different ways. It's not just reading and writing. It's like the different domains and the different reasons, objectives behind learning this language. So the peace accords, they signed these peace accords on the identity and rights of the indigenous people, okay? So they talked about the Mayan languages. They talked about how they descended from ancient Mayans. Again, this connection to their history as ancient Mayans really promoted the Mayans today, okay? They have really a connection, a strong cultural, historical connection. How language impacts your worldview. We saw that with the Innu population, your culture, and then also how you self-identify, right? These are your rights this is what the government really stressed, about why you should learn in these indigenous languages. And then part of this was like, they're part of their language rights, right? Like they really pursued bilingual education in Mayan languages and Spanish. They promoted Mayan and government services. They trained bilingual judges and interpreters, fostered appreciation of indigenous languages, and then they made these indigenous languages official, right? So Guatemala is a really good case study on, this top to bottom kind of language revitalization, how the government can get involved in making a language official. And they said, all languages should be respected, right? Right. So that's Guatemala. Here are the discussion questions. Number 1, in what ways are indigenous endangered languages and endangered species similar? In what ways are they different? Number 2, what are some advantages of studying a dead or formerly dead language like Latin or Hebrew? Or number 3, this is fun. Do some research on a language revitalization program. So you can do what I did and do a Google on Hawaiian or Cherokee or Sui or Lumbee or Blackfoot. How do they reinvigorate the language, right? So like, what are their strategies? What is their philosophy statement? How do they decide that this language is important and we want to revitalize it? We want to learn it, keep it, maintain it, cherish it for future generations. All right, interested to know your thoughts? I'll see you on the discussion board.